Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Guide to Enterprise Single Sign-On and Authentication. First, some notes. Everyone is on mute today. The presentation is being recorded, so a replay link and a copy of the slides will be emailed after the webinar. The webinar is hosted today by Brett Cooper and Alan Lampa. Alan is the principal architect at Blueflitch and has been in technology and mobility for more than 20 years, with a wealth of experience in program management for large, complex mobility implementations. Brett is a founding partner of Blueflitch and also has been in the tech and mobility industry for over 20 years with companies like Coca-Cola and Accenture. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Brett and Alan.
Today I'm with Alan Lampa, and we're going to cover a article we wrote last year specifically around enterprise SSO and authentication, and a guide to that. And we did some updates recently for this, and it's on our blog post if you want to catch it, and you can find the link to it in the show notes below. But Alan is the principal architect here at Blueflitch. So Alan has been doing software for, I guess, 20 plus years. I'm not going to say longer than that because it might be embarrassing, but Alan has a lot of experience across back end, front end, mobile, security, and in general overall architecture and infrastructure for various technologies, and has worked at a lot of different companies in the last 20 plus years. So Alan, thank you for joining me. I appreciate having on today.
Thanks, Brett. I'm glad to be here.
Got it. So we're going to start out with, I think the guide, just some of the points. I want to call out a couple key issues, or not key issues, but just key relevant things that people should be thinking about. And to start out, I think one of the things we always talk about is the history of authentication, which you go back to the early green screen systems in the old days, and the Unix side, how you have user accounts, user accounts have permissions, passwords go along with it. But I think more recently, a lot of the work that you and I have done, since we started working on the Windows CE days, which was a sort of a lightweight version of Windows. We built a lot of tooling around login for Windows CE and had the ability to do certain things. And then when Android came out in 2011, I know you and I sat down and did a lot of digging at that and looking at options for login and sign-on. Ended up building what is now the Blueflitch Enterprise Launcher, which handles single sign-on and authentication across all sorts of different Android devices in the enterprise. So typically Zebra, Honeywell, Samsung, but a lot of other manufacturers we support as well. So I guess, Alan, for you, when you think of the legacy, like green screen to Windows CE to Android and iOS, what are the biggest things that have stood out about that change over the last 20 plus years?
I think a lot of the changes happened on the platforms that they're running. If you think about the green screen apps, there wasn't really an attempt to integrate with or have single sign-on. When folks started getting their own emails, email became, how can I log into my email and be logged into everything else? So going from single applications needing authentication to browser-based applications, start seeing SAML getting introduced, and that introduced cookie-based authentication. Windows also introduced certificate-based authentication, so you log into your desktop and you get everything, right? So translating that to when we go into Android and iOS devices, right? Android didn't really have, or these devices never really had a standard for SSO. So up until sometime later, where Google did introduce the concept of from custom tabs, realizing the need for be able to support cookie-based authentication on devices.
Yeah, so I want to come back to that. I'll put a pin on that, but before we hop into that, can we talk about like the authentication versus authorization? So when you say authentication, what does that actually mean to you?
So authentication is really the process of verifying the identity of the user. It's verifying who you say you are to the company. So that's really authentication. Authorization is a separate piece in that, yes, we know who you are. We've confirmed that you are this user, but are you authorized to use a particular resource? Resource meaning, if I wanted to access a an HR system or an HR service, as a user, are you actually allowed to use that? Or very simply, if you're staff versus an administrator, you're both authenticated, you're both authenticated as employees, but one of you is authorized to access certain pieces of the service.
Got it. So authentication is validating you say who you are, and authorization is all the other processes around access to things or privileges to use different resources.
That's correct.
Got it. And then for on the authentication side, and then we all know password-based authentication or password pin-based auth, but what are the
Mhm.
other flavors of authentication that are out there that people use that we've seen people use in the enterprise?
So there is still password authentication. There is still enterprises still use certificate-based authentication. Um, but that's more of making sure that your device has the right certificates. So by virtue of your identity plus the machine that you're using, you're able to authenticate. Um, and then later on, like recently, right, we have biometric. We can leverage biometric authentication. You've got fingerprint readers on laptops. Your devices can do face or fingerprint authentication, and that satisfies some of the conditions around identifying who you are.
Got it. And I guess when you say certs, so the FIDO keys and those what I'm call PIV or CAC cards, like the government cards that have chips on them, do those have certs on them, or is there another mechanism within those that handles the authentication for them?
That's correct. So they do have so FIDO and the PIV cards, they do have certificates on them. So they're provisioned by the IT administrator and assigned to a particular user. So in those cases, there is a certificate specific for a user that the user can use to authenticate to systems. So that way, um, you have a username, you have a password that the user knows, and then it's something that they have. If they have a PIV or a FIDO key, that basically represents who they are as an identity.
Got it. And
And
then
then
multi-factors, well, I guess multi-factors, it can be a key, but I think the other thing we see multi-factor is you get a text message or you have a authenticator app, like Microsoft has the Microsoft Authenticator app on the phones. But so what are the other like options around multi-factor that you've seen out there?
so multi-factor, we've seen people use biometrics on devices. There's SMS, which is kind of easy, but um, not as secure as others. But primarily, the reason for two-factor authentication is to combat, you know, phishing, or like people can easily get your username and password, or you can be a victim to um, username or password attacks. And that way, it's just another level of verification. So it's either a phone call, make sure you still have your phone, or you have a key that has a company issued certificate in case of FIDO and PIV. And that's really the main goal for that multi-factor piece, that you have all of them before you can authenticate.
Got it. So now that we've covered that, let's shift back into single sign-on, which is, I think you talked about this earlier. This is where you log in once and they're able to get to all of your applications. I know there's a lot of underpinnings within this in different ways to do single sign-on, but for you, when you look at companies, like what are the key benefits we see around single sign-on? What's the reason for companies to go invest in single sign-on technology and supporting this in all the different applications?
So the single sign-on, if you think about it, we talk about the convenience for users where they only have to enter their credentials once and be logged into anything. That's one part of it. But to me, as a security person, right, you have to think about just the thought of managing different identities across your different applications, right? So you want one source where all of your resources are protected against. Practically, if you think about it, when a user leaves the company, you want to be able to disable one place, and it removes access for that user for all the applications. If we detect a security incident and an identity is compromised, right, you can adjust that and have it apply to all applications. From an IT security standpoint, it makes management easier, if not required, for today's environments.
You got it. And I think the other thing with SSO, around management, one thing I always hear too, that's sort of a hidden cost. You have the cost of users logging in multiple times. You have the security cost, which you just articulated. But there's also the help desk cost, which I think the help desk tickets are $70 to $90 a password reset, both the cost on the employee side, the cost on the help desk side, and then all the systems go around it. But with single sign, I know that reduces a lot of the help desk issues because like you said, you have a single password across all of your accounts. It's it can be federated across um, different groups or systems. Um, but I think that's another one. I think the other thing too is from a just general, like, how much value is there in SSO just for the end users? Like, if you had to guess, like, what is the cost you see or that you've looked at across different clients you work with?
So if you think about the cost for the end user, right? So you'll spend, um, depending on how many hours you log in, if I can't be productive for a couple of hours because I'm trying to get my password reset,
Hmm.
right? Those costs add up per employee per day. Especially now where, um, we mandate users to change their passwords pretty frequently. You'll end up getting that spike for help desk calls and unproductive cycles every time you have to go do password changes. Um, so just being able to do SSO, on these devices reduces all of that, pretty significantly.
Got it. Yeah, and I know on the actual end user side, it depends on the device, but I think on Android devices, one of the studies we did was most people, typing in username, password with a smaller keyboard is going to take 30 to 40 seconds. I've seen some younger people that type a lot faster than me. You can get it down to 15, 20, but it's definitely, if you have to do that 13 times a day or 15 times a day and you fat finger it once or twice, it definitely adds up in the amount of time across, thousands of employees in an organization. I think one study we ran with a company that had 4 applications that users are logging into throughout the day. I think they saved $700 plus per device just on the end user productivity. So not in the other areas you called, it's not in the security or password resets or management side. So there's definitely a lot of value to be gotten from single sign-on. I think another area, and we focus, so there's single sign-on on the consumer side, which maybe you could talk about this, but the idea of I can use my Google login to log into a bunch of other systems. What is that concept? What is that? How does that actually work on the end user or consumer side as a person out there in the world?
Yeah, so shared login. So it's a concept of, it's similar to federation, right? So I'm trying to access a service, your application. Instead of them authenticating you directly, they rely on a third party like Google, Facebook, um, or Apple, for example, where they will send you, when you say sign in, when you click on sign into Google, that actually sends you to Google to authenticate your identity, and Google tells the resource or your application that yes, this I've confirmed that this person is Alan Lampa, and I've identified him through multiple ways, either through that multi-factor authentication or biometrics, and that provides the application your identity, to let you through.
So it's not actually those applications in that I think the model is it's called federated, but they don't ever get your credentials. So they're just asking Google, is this actually Alan Lampa? And Google says
Right.
yes, yes, and Alan. I guess it'll prompt you if it wants to share certain types of data with you. And that is the process of federations. You have different systems that are that have trust between them, and one system is trusting Google for that to authenticate for them, right?
Right. It's a two-way trust, right? So the application has to register with Google too that they're allowed to receive that information. You'll see it when you log into your phones, where it's going to ask you like, "Hey, this application wants to access your contact information," and that's because Google will send this application your information, and that's what the application will use to create your identity in their system. The main difference is that your password is never shared. Your password is still with Google and never with the application.
Got it. And then the identity provider, or I guess IDP, which is the commonly used term. So that identity provider, in this case, it's Google, but in the corporate world, what does the identity provider landscape look like? What are the sources of truth for identities? What's the most common ones we see on the enterprise side?
The biggest one today is Azure or Entra um, ID. So because they've started from the Active Directory world, when everybody was still on premise, migrating over to Azure, and they've also pushed all of their on-prem Active Directory customers to use Azure AD or Entra today. So that's our biggest one. Okta is another one. It's also big, and you have other OIDC providers like OneLogin. Um, Ping Identity is also big. So those are the main players we've seen in this space.
Got it. And you mentioned Active Directory, which that is, is an early 90s identity provider, and that was sort of based on LDAP, which was 70s and 80s. Are there still people using LDAP and Active Directory out there locally on-prem, or do you see a lot of that still?
On From the enterprise world, yes, there are still a lot of companies that still use Active Directory. Um, some of them use it as today to be able to support some of the cloud-based applications they federate to their local Active Directory instance, and that's something that a lot of these new IDP support. Um, so it's still their source of truth because they still do have legacy applications that tie into Active Directory using LDAP connectors, or directly through that domain.
Got it. When those newer IDPs get connected to one of those legacies, you said that are they synchronizing user accounts, or is it still doing the going to that legacy AD or LDAP as the source of actual authentication?
Yeah, the federation concept applies in this case where, I need to access my Office 365 apps that only use Azure AD. So when Azure needs to authenticate the user, it federates back to the customer's on-premise Active Directory, um, which then identifies the user or authenticates the user and gives it back to Azure. So
Got it.
it's in this case, the company still holds all of the user data within their Active Directory, and Azure is your federated IDP.
Got it. And I know I mentioned this, but the replication, like username and password replication, I feel like in general, that's always been a big no-no in the security world. But can you talk about the drawbacks you've seen around places where they've insisted on doing user and identity replication?
Yeah, the main issue with password replication is there's timing and security. Security aspects to it. It's again going back to if I have to disable a user or change a user's authorization, you need to worry about making sure that passwords get synced over across different systems. There's just multiple points of failure that can happen versus just having a single source of truth and using federation to tie them all together.
Got it. And I know there's a lot of on the consumer side, I guess we would call like password managers. So the LastPass, OneLogins, even Google Chrome. That is not necessarily SSO, is it? That's more of just like that
It's
would be.
more of a in our it's might use SSO would mean same sign in or same sign on. So it's the same credentials you could use across different places. It's not true SSO, but it does give you the convenience of not having to remember passwords.
Got it. And what are the downsides on password managers like the one logins of the world?
So password managers are great for convenience, but with that convenience, you do get the risk of um, being having all of your passwords in one place. Um, you still have one master password that can control your identity. A lot of these password managers do a good job of using end-to-end encryption for transmitting passwords, but um, if you manage to lose or compromise your master password, hackers can or bad actors can potentially get to your other passwords.
Got it. And then also still in the browser, that password manager is entering a password into a box. So it's actually stuffing those characters in there. So if you have some JavaScript or a bot or something that's watching that, you theoretically could pull that out, right?
Right. If you're not taking necessary precautions about, are you accessing secure sites? You're potentially putting yourself at risk by still letting people get your passwords.
Got it. And I think one of the other phrases that out there is tokens, or digital tokens. I know like physical tokens would be like the little RSA keys you get, but
Mhm.
when I hear the phrase token in regards to an IDP and authentication, what does that actually mean? What does a token do?
A token is it's you could think of it as a digital ID that is digitally signed by the IDP or the service provider. In this case, the application. Um, it's a it's an attestation at a given point in time of your identity of your authorization. I say given point in time because tokens typically or should have information in it about when it was issued, when does it expire, um, and the digital signature on these prove ownership that this token came from this entity, so that the other entity can trust it.
Got it.
Um,
So
they are
you get a token, and then it's time bound, it's signed, so you can't fudge it. So you can't go change the time on the token and be like, oh, this is actually make it a longer time frame. So it is useful for a certain period of time. So it's like, you use this token now or you lose it, right? It's kind of
right.
the pattern there.
Correct. And IDPs have a way to either refresh this token. So you will continue to request authorization to get a new token.
Got it. And then another phrase we hear a lot is SAML. Can you talk about what SAML is, what maybe where it came from, and is it still prevalent across a lot of applications?
Yeah, SAML was one of the earlier ways that was a common protocol for identifying users across different providers. So if you think of uh, a service provider needing to authenticate with an IDP, SAML was a way using XML and certificate-based exchanges to verify trust between the application and the identity provider. That was one of the earlier ones that we could use on the web, and there's still a lot of that in use today.
Got it. And what is I think when the phrase I hear more often now in the last 5 to 10 years is OAuth and OIDC. Can you talk about what is OAuth and how is it used differently than SAML, or is it pretty much the
Yeah,
same,
so
just newer technology?
yeah, OAuth was really focused more on authorization before, but the idea there was for OAuth, I would request authorization for a particular resource with the IDP. In exchange, the IDP would return back to me a token that I can use for making API calls. Um, OIDC puts an authentication layer on top of that, where it adds additional authentication pieces where I can authenticate and authorize separately. So that I can potentially authenticate and I can do just-in-time authorization. So if I need to access a particular resource, I can ask tokens for that resource. Um, and 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 the company can limit authorization to specific providers. So whenever you need it, you can request it via OIDC.
Got it. So OAuth is the mechanism for the tokens going back and forth, the granting permissions, and then OIDC is the auth layer that goes on top of that, and is really just they're paired together. So you can't really have one without the other. And
Correct. Yeah.
got
There
it.
are still systems that just use OAuth 2 today. But today when you say you're OIDC compliant, you're actually using both.
Got it. And then shifting gears and talk a bit about the how to actually implement SSO on mobile devices. So I think the let's frame this with Android. So Android mobile devices in the enterprise. This is something we do a lot. I know there's a couple different mechanisms or systems out there. I know Microsoft has their shared device mode. There's some other pieces that Google has built and supported within Android itself for OAuth. Can you start with the the Android pieces? So what are the common mechanisms on Android for implementing SSO in applications or implementing SSO in a session for a device?
The primary way for doing SSO on Android, at least the official Google supported one, is the use of Chrome custom tabs. So we're still using browser-based logins. So one application will open the identity provider's login page on a Chrome custom tab. During that authentication process, the IDP will drop session cookies in that browser, and the idea is that other applications can authenticate using the same method, and they would be authenticated because of the presence of that session cookie. So that's the preferred primary way for doing it on Android devices, and it's also the same on iOS by using the Safari browser as your common user agent. There are some other, before the standard though, some providers did use some other creative ways of doing SSO. Some of them use agents on the devices, um, or a lot of them would just use their backend to store session for these devices.
Got it. And this is so that standard Google or Android way, the CCT way, the custom Chrome tabs. How is that different than the Microsoft MSAL implementation? What is Microsoft doing different with how they're trying to do SSO for applications on devices?
Yeah. The way that Microsoft implemented SSO for their devices, essentially they created an authenticator app. So they have an authenticator app that acts as a broker on the device, and that holds the identity of the user. So on a Microsoft shared device, when you hit login, you're actually logging into the authenticator, and the authenticator is storing your credentials, or at least your authenticated session, so that when other applications that know how to talk to this broker, like Teams or Microsoft Edge, if they're both running in shared device mode, they'll actually go to the authenticator and ask for your session, and then use that to log you into Edge and Teams.
Got it. What do you think is the driver for the reason Microsoft went that approach as opposed to going with the standard Android CCT approach?
I think it could be because of the drive around just getting out of using cookies to do that. Um, uh, and then there's also around control over where that data is stored.
Got it. So
Um,
when you say cookies, I guess one of the issues there is that if you have multiple browsers, so if you have Microsoft Edge, Chrome, and let's call it Island browser on the same device, those can't
Mhm.
necessarily share cookies across them, right? So you have to have an individual authentication session for each one of them.
Right. So the way that cookies are stored on Android devices, they're only shared within the application. You cannot share it between applications just to keep to that siloed private storage model.
Hmm.
That's why Chrome Custom Tab is that single user agent. In this case, would be Chrome, um, but um, but that's really the only way that we can support it today.
Got it. And then I know you talked about a bit about this earlier, about the different approaches for authentication itself. So I know we have the standard username password. We have multi-factor, which has, the second factor. I think one of the other things you mentioned was biometrics. Can
Mhm.
you talk a bit about biometrics. So I guess the biggest question that I get from a lot of people is my biometric data secure? So is my fingerprint, is my face, is my voice secure? Can it be reused or hacked? Is, Tom Cruise Mission Impossible going to show up and have my face and copy my eyeballs? So what are your thoughts on the biometrics itself, and then the ease of implementation, and then also just the long-term security of it?
So at least with biometric authentication, it's something that you have. You don't need to worry about carrying around it or losing it. The security for these processes are pretty tight. Google actually requires this data to be stored in a separate hardware or a chip on the device for security. So from a user standpoint, it's pretty secure. Of course, the Mission Impossible pieces are pretty impossible in the real
Um,
world.
and then, I think one of the things people always ask me is with biometrics, and I don't want a picture of my face stored. This is my dad or my aunt asking me this, but they don't want their face stored on a computer somewhere. And I'm like, despite the fact they have 10,000 pictures on Facebook, but like that data itself, what is for facial rec, what is it actually storing? What is that data that companies use there?
Yeah, for facial recognition, it actually just stores metadata about your face. So it takes data points of your face, and basically, layman's terms, it's really just looking at distances between the different points in your face and storing it as binary data. And that's really your face data. So at least they're not really storing your actual image per se, which makes hacking and reproducing your face from that data harder.
Got it. And then the other biometrics of fingerprints, I know a lot of devices had fingerprints. Apple had fingerprints. It ended up they sort of went to face rec. What was the drawback with the fingerprint readers, or was the main issues we saw with that? And sort of that was sort of a fad. I feel like it came and went, and some devices still have it. But what's your thoughts around the biometric fingerprints?
Some people still have it. And on some devices, the main challenge is where do you put the reader? Google tried by putting it in the back. Today, they're using optical fingerprint readers where you put it on. That's where the screen fingerprint reader comes in. It is fairly limited. You do run into issues where fingerprints are hard to read, or just given the fact that it's optical. Um, which means that they have to lower the threshold on accuracy just to make it work. So we've seen phones that do both fingerprint and face at the same time, um, just to augment that. But in the enterprise, it's really difficult to keep fingerprints, just from a privacy standpoint. From Android devices in particular, fingerprints are stored on a separate chip, which means sharing across devices is virtually impossible.
Got it. And you mentioned the PIV or CAC cards earlier. I know one of the things we've also seen with a couple of companies, Blue Flash and Improvat, a couple other folks, is using NFC badges for authentication. Can you talk about what we've seen there across the industry, and what sort of that middle ground that's not biometrics but is a token that's not necessarily cert based? What does that look like for using NFC for auth on devices?
For us, we've implemented where it's a way to identify the user, but typically we still use a second factor because it is something that can be stolen or lost. We want to make sure that, yes, it's something that you have, and we know that's you based on the NFC data we've stored on the tag, but we'll still require either a PIN or a password or some other multi-factor data in conjunction with the NFC tag.
Got it. And then another topic that came up, and you sort of talked about this earlier, but the session. Like when I log into a shared computer, there's definitely like I want to make sure like all of my data is gone when it's done. Like what is what are the things that need to get cleaned up on shared computers or employee or work computers when a user's done with their session? What actually needs to happen there once they're out of their job per se?
Right. I mean, we could start with the browser. So you'll notice whenever you're accessing a website, it asks you, are you in a private or a public computer? And the reason for that is when you're visiting a website, it's tracking information about you. It's storing the cookies that it has stores information about you as a user. When we're talking about shared devices, we want to be able to clear out that data. So the stuff that you browsed, anything about your identity, anything about your user ID or your patterns need to get erased from that device. Um, uh, if not that, there's also the session cookies that Google or the IDP drops on the browser. So that needs to get deleted as well. Um, Without those, the user will get prompted to re-authenticate on the browser. Other pieces like native applications on devices, you still do want to clear out application data. We've advised our enterprise customers to build applications where data is not stored on devices. And that's primarily more from a security standpoint, where we could easily clear out data for an application, making sure that not only the user's data is cleared out when they log out, but also company data that could potentially be compromised if the device is stolen and compromised.
Got it. And then that's I think the two modes of devices, I'm going to call it like a personal carry device. So your device you keep in your pocket versus like one of these like shared enterprise devices. So there's personal carry and there's shared. So really the scenarios you're talking about is a shared device. So making sure users log in at the beginning of the shift, and then at the end of their shift, everything gets wiped out. I know one of the things we've heard of, especially in Europe, GDPR is big. So if you don't wipe user employee data, that can open you up to a GDPR lawsuit. But is there anything else that stands out to you, the difference between the consumer device versus the shared enterprise device?
From a consumer device, there is an expectation that it does remember you. So there are pieces that we do want to get cleared out, like your session information. But on a personal device, there is expectation of some personal information being stored and cached on these devices. What we do recommend, or the practices we follow for applications that are meant for personal devices, of course, is storing this information that you want to store in the private storage to the application. There's always, from a device-wide setting, there's always encryption for the device and mandating a PIN. Or some sort of lock on your device. In particular, banking apps or applications like banking apps, for example, take it a step further and actually check your device for potential security compromises, such as whether or not you're rooted or they have debugging enabled and prevent you from using their app in those scenarios.
Yeah, I know I've definitely seen some cool companies out there doing that, like the CrowdStrikes of the world. And then I guess the last big question I had for you is, I know we talked about this, but practically as a company, if I have a bunch of disparate systems where users are typing in different passwords across different apps, and I want to have let's just take it back to I want to have a mobile device single sign-on strategy. What are the steps somebody should do to get to the point where they have a bunch of different systems are logging into different passwords, to the point where they have this utopia of log in once a day and then have your passwords throughout the shifts? What are the steps that you advise or counsel clients on as you work with them?
So, in an ideal world, what I would advise them would be to take a look at your applications and see how you can potentially integrate them to have a single sort of source of truth. Outside of mobile devices or desktops, how do I make sure that, or is there anything I can do with my applications where they're all authenticating against a single IDP? Um, uh, that solves a lot of the security issues up front as far as managing passwords and authorization for your resources. Because once you have that set up, or at least have a roadmap to how to get there. Now you can start talking about, having a device that's set up with, for example, our Bluefletch launcher, and just have one IDP to control all of your applications.
Yeah. All right. So step one is, I guess you sort of infer, but have your IDP. Step two is look at all of your applications and just rationalize which ones can be federated into that IDP and trust it for single sign-on. And then once you go from there, you start looking at the more complex solutions like the Blue Fletches or Imprimatos or other companies in the world.
Right.
Is there
There are
anything else? I guess other like big gotchas that companies should be thinking about as they look at implementing SSO?
I think one of the biggest ones is that, especially for older companies, you are going to run into issues where your software just cannot support SSO. In which case, talking to trusted providers or service providers who've done this before can definitely assist you with figuring out, what's the best way to integrate with these apps. There are multiple ways to do it. There are ways to do it on the device. There are ways to do it on the back end. It really depends on your infrastructure and what kind of applications you have.
Awesome. Well, that's all I got for time today. And Alan, thank you very much for walking through this with us. Appreciate it. And if you have follow-up questions, please reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@bluefletch.com or on our website below. Have a great rest of your day.